The small town hall stood quietly at the corner of a narrow street where not many people passed during the day. It was an old building with tall windows and wooden doors that had faded a little with time. Inside the hall, rows of simple chairs faced a small stage where different community events were held. Sometimes there were school meetings, sometimes small celebrations, and sometimes music evenings where people came to share their talent. Every morning, before most people arrived, a young woman would unlock the hall and begin her daily routine. She moved slowly and carefully through the room, opening the windows to let fresh air inside. The sound of birds outside mixed with the quiet creaking of the wooden floor as she walked. After that, she cleaned the chairs, dusted the stage, and arranged everything so the hall looked welcoming for the day. To most people in the town, she was simply the quiet worker who helped keep the hall organized. She rarely spoke unless someone asked her something. When she did talk, her voice was soft and polite. Many people greeted her with a quick smile, but few stopped long enough to know much about her life. She did not seem to mind. In fact, she almost preferred it that way. There was one place in the hall where she often paused during her work. On the stage, slightly to the left side, stood an old piano. The piano had been there for many years. Its black surface had small scratches, and some of the keys were slightly worn. Still, it remained one of the most important pieces in the hall because it was used during music programs and community gatherings. Whenever she finished sweeping the floor near the stage, she would look at the piano for a moment longer than necessary. Sometimes she gently wiped the dust from its surface even when it was already clean. If someone walked into the hall during that moment, they might notice the thoughtful expression on her face, but they would not understand what it meant. For her, the piano was more than just an instrument. It carried memories. Long before she started working in the town hall, music had been a very important part of her life. When she was a child, there had been a small piano in her home. It was not a perfect instrument, but it was enough to fill the house with music every evening. She had spent many hours sitting at that piano, learning how each note could create a feeling. At first, the lessons were simple. Her teacher had shown her how to place her fingers on the keys and how to listen carefully to every sound. Over time, the lessons became more challenging. She practiced scales, melodies, and pieces that required patience and focus. Those years were some of the happiest moments she remembered. Music had felt like a language that allowed her to say things that words could never express. But life does not always move in the direction people expect. As she grew older, difficult circumstances in her family forced many changes. The piano lessons stopped, and the instrument that once filled her home with music was eventually gone. Responsibilities replaced practice time, and slowly the music that once shaped her days faded into the background. Still, the love for it never disappeared completely. It simply became something quiet inside her heart. That was one reason the old piano in the town hall always caught her attention. Even though she had not played seriously for many years, just seeing the instrument brought back memories of those earlier days. Sometimes, when the hall was completely empty and there was no event scheduled, she would sit on the piano bench for a moment. She would gently press a single key, letting the sound echo softly through the quiet room. Then she would quickly stand up again and return to her work, almost as if she had been caught doing something she should not. Not many people knew about these small moments. The people who organized events at the hall only saw her as someone reliable who could arrange chairs, prepare the stage, and help visitors find their seats. They appreciated her work, but they never imagined she might have a deeper connection to the music performed there. In fact, during music nights, she usually stayed near the back of the room. While performers played on stage, she quietly watched from the side, making sure everything ran smoothly. Her eyes often followed the pianist's hands as they moved across the keys. There was always a thoughtful look in her expression during those moments, as if she were remembering something important. The town itself was not very large, but it had a warm community spirit. People knew each other well, and events at the hall were often the highlight of the week. Families gathered there to listen to local singers, young students performing simple songs, or musicians sharing their favorite pieces. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the tall windows, preparations were being made for another community music evening. Posters had already been placed around town inviting everyone to attend. Inside the hall, the usual quiet worker moved from one row of chairs to another, making sure everything was perfectly arranged. She checked the stage carefully. The microphone stand was placed in the center, and the old piano had been polished so it looked presentable for the event. A few organizers were discussing the schedule nearby. They spoke about the performers who would arrive later in the evening. Some were students from the local school, while others were amateur musicians who enjoyed sharing their music with the community. As she finished adjusting the final row of chairs, she glanced once more toward the piano. The sunlight reflected softly on its surface. For a moment, she imagined what it would feel like to sit there again and play freely without worrying about anything else. But the thought disappeared as quickly as it had come. She had learned long ago not to hold on to such ideas. Life had already moved in a different direction. Instead, she picked up a cleaning cloth and carefully wiped the last bit of dust from the piano lid. Her fingers rested on the smooth wood for a brief second before she stepped away. To anyone watching, it would look like nothing more than part of her daily routine. But inside her mind, a quiet memory of music was still alive. And although she did not realize it yet, the evening event that was being prepared in that hall would soon bring that hidden part of her life back into the light in a way she never expected. For now, however, the hall remained calm and peaceful. The chairs were ready. The stage was prepared, and the old piano waited silently for the music that would soon fill the room. By late afternoon, the quiet town hall no longer felt empty. The calm silence that usually filled the building slowly changed as people began arriving to prepare for the evening music event. Outside, the sky had turned a warm golden color, and soft sunlight passed through the tall windows of the hall. Dust particles floated in the air like tiny sparks while the last preparations were being made. The young woman who worked there moved around the room the same way she always did, quietly, carefully, making sure everything looked neat. Rows of chairs were placed perfectly, the floor had been swept, and the stage looked ready for the performers who would soon arrive. Events like this were common in the town, but people still looked forward to them. Music evenings gave everyone a chance to relax, forget their daily worries, and enjoy something simple together. Families would come with children, older residents would sit in the front rows, and local performers would share their songs and melodies. Near the entrance, two organizers stood with a clipboard, discussing the schedule for the night. One of them read the list of performers while the other checked the time slots. "First we have the school group singing," one of them said. "Then the violin student. After that comes the piano performance." The other organizer nodded while looking at the paper. Everything seemed to be arranged perfectly. Meanwhile, the quiet worker finished adjusting the last chair and walked toward the stage. The old piano stood there, polished and ready for the evening. She gently placed the piano bench in the right position, making sure it faced the audience neatly. Her fingers briefly touched the edge of the instrument. It was only for a second, but the small gesture carried a quiet feeling that no one else noticed. Soon the first few visitors began entering the hall. People greeted each other warmly and slowly filled the seats. Soft conversations spread across the room, and the once quiet building became lively with friendly voices. Children ran between the chairs until their parents asked them to sit down. A few teenagers stood near the back, talking and laughing quietly. Some older guests took their seats early, eager not to miss any of the performances. The young woman stayed near the side wall, observing everything while making sure the event ran smoothly. She had done this many times before. Usually she preferred staying unnoticed, blending into the background while others enjoyed the spotlight on stage. But this evening would not go exactly as planned. A few minutes before the event was supposed to begin, one of the organizers looked toward the entrance with a concerned expression. He checked his watch, then looked again at the door. "The pianist hasn't arrived yet," he said quietly to the other organizer. The second person frowned slightly. "Maybe they're just running late." They waited another few minutes. More audience members arrived, and the room continued filling with people. Still, the performer who was supposed to play the piano did not appear. The organizers stepped aside and began making a few phone calls. Their voices were low, but their expressions slowly showed worry. Finally, one of them sighed and lowered the phone. "No answer," he said. The other organizer rubbed his forehead. "That's not good. The piano performance is right in the middle of the program." They both looked toward the stage where the old piano sat quietly under the soft lights. Without that performance, there would be an empty gap in the schedule. The audience would notice. They discussed possible solutions for a moment. Maybe they could move another performer earlier. Maybe someone else in the audience knew how to play something simple. But finding someone at the last minute was not easy. As they talked, the quiet worker walked past them while carrying a small stack of programs for the audience. One of the organizers suddenly looked at her. It was not a serious thought at first, more of a casual idea. He smiled slightly and said in a half-joking tone, "Do you know how to play the piano by any chance?" She stopped walking. For a moment she thought she had heard him wrong. The organizer laughed lightly. "I mean, even something very simple. Just a short piece. We might need someone to fill in." The question surprised her completely. She looked toward the stage where the piano waited silently. Inside her mind, old memories stirred again. The feeling of sitting on a piano bench. The sound of keys echoing through a quiet room. Years of music she had once practiced with patience and passion. But those memories belonged to another time. Now she was simply the person who arranged chairs and cleaned the hall. She hesitated before answering. "A little," she said softly. The organizer smiled again, still not taking the idea too seriously. "Well, if the pianist doesn't show up, maybe you could play something small. Just a simple tune to fill a few minutes." He said it casually, almost like a joke between busy preparations. But the words stayed in her mind. Play something simple. She nodded politely and continued walking, but her thoughts were no longer calm. Across the room, the audience continued filling the hall. The music evening was about to begin, and the organizers decided to start the program while they figured out what to do about the missing pianist. The first performance went smoothly. A group of children walked onto the stage and sang a cheerful song. The audience clapped warmly and smiled as the young voices filled the room. After that came a violin student who played a gentle melody. Everything looked normal to the audience. But behind the scenes, the organizers were still worried. The missing piano performer had still not arrived. One of them quietly approached the young woman again near the side of the hall. He spoke in a calm voice so the guests would not hear. "It seems our pianist won't make it tonight," he said. "Would you be willing to play something? Just a short piece. Nothing complicated." Her heart beat a little faster. For a few seconds she did not answer. The stage lights reflected softly on the polished surface of the piano. People in the audience chatted quietly, unaware of the small problem behind the scenes. She looked down at her hands. Hands that had once practiced music every day. Hands that had not played seriously for many years. Part of her felt nervous. Another part felt something else. A quiet excitement she had not felt in a long time. But she remembered the organizer's words again. Just something simple. Nothing complicated. She slowly nodded. "If you think it will help," she said quietly. The organizer smiled with relief. "That would be wonderful. Just a short piece will do." He thanked her and quickly returned to the stage area. Meanwhile, she remained standing near the side of the room, her thoughts moving faster than before. In a few minutes, she might be sitting at that piano in front of a full audience. The idea felt unreal. For years she had avoided attention. For years she had kept her connection to music hidden. And now suddenly she was being asked to play. The next performance on stage came to an end, and the audience applauded. The organizer stepped forward and spoke into the microphone. "And now," he said with a friendly smile, "we will have a short piano performance." He glanced toward the side of the stage where she stood quietly. "Please welcome our next performer." The audience looked toward the piano, expecting to see the scheduled musician. Instead, they saw the quiet worker from the hall slowly walking toward the stage. Some people in the audience looked confused. Others whispered to each other softly. They had seen her cleaning the hall many times. No one expected her to be the pianist. She walked carefully toward the piano bench, her heart beating louder with every step. The room slowly became quieter as people watched with curiosity. A few audience members even smiled slightly, thinking this would simply be a short and simple moment. After all, she had been asked to play something easy, just a simple tune. But no one in that room knew the truth yet. Not even the organizers who had invited her. Because the quiet woman approaching the piano was carrying years of music inside her. And the moment she placed her hands on the keys, everything in that hall was about to change. The hall had grown quiet in a way that felt different from before. Only a few minutes earlier, the room had been filled with soft conversations, laughter, and the sounds of people settling into their seats. But now, as the young woman slowly walked toward the piano on the stage, those sounds faded into low whispers. Many people in the audience recognized her. They had seen her many times moving chairs, cleaning the stage, or helping visitors find their seats during events. She was the quiet worker who always stayed in the background. Because of that, her appearance on the stage felt unexpected. Some people leaned closer to one another and spoke softly. "Isn't she the one who works here? I've seen her cleaning the hall before. Is she really going to play?" Their voices were not loud, but the curious whispers spread through the room like a gentle breeze. She could feel their eyes following her as she walked. Each step toward the piano seemed slower than the last. Her heart was beating quickly, and for a moment she wondered if she had made the right decision by agreeing to help. The stage lights shone softly above her, making the polished surface of the piano glow. When she reached the piano bench, she paused. The room was now almost completely silent. From where she stood, she could see the audience clearly. Families sat together in rows, children leaned forward with curious expressions, and older guests watched quietly with folded hands. A few people in the back still whispered to each other, but most simply waited. They expected something simple. After all, the organizer had only asked her to fill a short gap in the program. Nothing serious, just a few minutes of music. She slowly sat down on the bench. The familiar feeling of the wooden seat beneath her brought back memories instantly. It felt strange and comforting at the same time, like returning to a place she had not visited in years. Her hands rested in her lap for a moment. She looked down at the piano keys. Some of them were slightly worn from years of use, but they still carried the quiet promise of music. Inside her mind, many thoughts moved quickly. She remembered the organizer's words again. Just play something simple. A small, easy melody would be enough. She could play a short tune, thank the audience politely, and leave the stage without drawing too much attention. That would be the safest choice. But as she stared at the keys, something deeper stirred inside her. For years she had kept her love for music hidden. Life had moved in different directions, and playing the piano had slowly become only a memory. Now suddenly, she was sitting in front of an audience again. A quiet feeling rose in her chest. It was not fear. It was something closer to longing. The longing to feel music again the way she once had. In the audience, a small child whispered loudly enough for nearby people to hear. "Is she going to start?" A few people smiled softly. The organizers stood near the side of the stage, watching with patient expressions. They did not expect anything extraordinary. They were simply relieved that someone had agreed to help fill the empty space in the program. Meanwhile, the young woman gently lifted her hands and placed them above the keys. Her fingers hovered there for a moment. She closed her eyes briefly and took a slow breath. In that quiet second, the noisy thoughts in her mind faded away. Instead, another memory appeared. She saw herself as a child again, sitting at a small piano in a simple room. Her teacher stood nearby, reminding her to listen carefully to every note. Music had never been about showing off or impressing others. It had always been about feeling something real. The memory made her smile slightly. When she opened her eyes again, the nervous feeling had softened. Her hands lowered onto the keys. The first sound that came from the piano was very soft. Just a single note. It floated gently through the air like a small ripple across still water. The audience remained quiet. She pressed another key. then another. At first, the melody moved slowly and simply, just like the kind of tune people expected. A few listeners nodded slightly, thinking the performance would remain light and short. But as the notes continued, something subtle began to change. The music did not stop after a few simple measures. Instead, it flowed into a deeper and more emotional melody. Her fingers moved more confidently across the keys. The gentle sounds filled the hall with warmth, and the audience began to listen more carefully. People who had been whispering earlier slowly turned their full attention toward the stage. The music carried a feeling that was difficult to explain. It was calm but also powerful, soft, yet full of emotion. Each note seemed connected to the next in a way that felt natural and alive. One of the organizers near the side of the stage looked surprised. He had expected a short beginner tune. But this was different. The young woman at the piano no longer looked nervous. Her shoulders were relaxed, and her hands moved smoothly across the keyboard. It was clear that she knew exactly what she was doing. In the audience, the whispers had completely stopped. Children who had been shifting in their seats now sat still, listening carefully. Some people leaned forward slightly, as if they did not want to miss even a single note. The melody slowly grew richer. Her left hand added deeper tones while her right hand carried the main melody higher and higher. The music seemed to tell a quiet story. A story of memories, patience, and feelings that had waited a long time to be heard again. Even people who knew very little about music could sense that something special was happening. A man in the third row quietly whispered to his friend, "She's not playing something simple." His friend nodded slowly. "No, she isn't." On the stage, the young woman was no longer thinking about the audience at all. The room, the chairs, and the curious faces had faded into the background of her mind. All that remained was the music. Her fingers moved faster now, flowing naturally across the keys with practiced control. Some passages were soft and delicate, while others carried stronger emotion. The old piano, which had been silent for most of the day, now filled the entire hall with sound. Even the organizers looked at each other with surprise. None of them had expected this quiet worker to play with such confidence and feeling. And yet, she continued as if the music had been waiting inside her all along. Every note seemed to carry years of hidden passion. Years of practice that had never truly disappeared. The melody rose gently, then softened again like a calm wave returning to the shore. The audience remained completely silent. No whispers, no movement, only the music, and the quiet realization spreading through the room that the person they had always overlooked was now revealing something extraordinary. But the performance was far from finished. In fact, the music was only beginning to unfold into something even more powerful. And as the young woman continued playing, the audience had no idea that the most breathtaking part of the performance was still ahead. The sound of the piano continued to flow through the hall like a calm river. What had started as a gentle melody had slowly grown into something deeper and richer. The audience sat quietly, listening with full attention. Many people had already forgotten that this performance was only supposed to be a small replacement in the program. The young woman sitting at the piano no longer looked like the shy worker who usually moved chairs and cleaned the stage. Her posture had changed. Her shoulders were relaxed, and her hands moved across the keys with confidence and calm focus. The music seemed to carry its own life. Every note blended smoothly with the next, creating a story without words. At first, some people in the audience had expected a short and simple tune. But now they realized that something much more meaningful was happening in front of them. A woman sitting near the middle row leaned toward her friend and whispered softly, "She plays like someone who has been doing this for years." Her friend nodded slowly without taking his eyes off the stage. "Maybe she has." On the stage, the melody slowly changed again. The soft and emotional opening began to transform into something brighter and more energetic. Her right hand moved more quickly across the higher keys while her left hand added deep, steady chords underneath. The music began to fill the entire hall with strength. The old piano, which had seemed quiet and ordinary before, now sounded powerful and alive. Each note echoed clearly through the room. A young boy sitting near the front row leaned forward with wide eyes. "Wow," he whispered to his mother. Even the organizers standing near the side of the stage looked amazed. One of them quietly shook his head in disbelief. "I had no idea she could play like this," he murmured. The other organizer crossed his arms and watched carefully. "Neither did I." Meanwhile, the young woman continued playing as if the world around her had disappeared. Her fingers moved naturally, guided by years of practice she had once thought were left behind. The piano keys responded to her touch with warmth and clarity. Inside her mind, something beautiful was happening. The music she was playing was not just notes written on paper. It carried memories and feelings that had been waiting quietly for a long time. Each part of the melody reminded her of moments from her past. The gentle sections felt like the peaceful evenings when she had first learned how to play. The stronger sections reminded her of the determination she once had while practicing difficult pieces again and again. All of those memories blended together in the music she was creating now. In the audience, people sat still, completely focused on the performance. Some listeners closed their eyes for a moment, letting the sound carry them away. Others watched her hands carefully, amazed by the way they moved so quickly and smoothly. The music continued to grow. The tempo increased slightly, and the melody became more dramatic. Her fingers moved faster across the keyboard, creating bright runs of notes that sparkled like falling rain. A quiet gasp escaped from someone in the audience. It was no longer possible to think of this as a simple performance. This was something special. The young woman's expression remained calm, but her eyes showed deep concentration. Every movement of her hands was controlled and confident. At one moment, the music suddenly softened again. The powerful rhythm faded into a gentle, emotional section. Her fingers slowed down, pressing the keys lightly as if each note carried a quiet secret. The hall felt even more silent during this part. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the children seemed completely absorbed by the music. The soft melody floated through the room like a peaceful memory. It felt warm and thoughtful, almost like someone speaking quietly from the heart. A man sitting near the back of the hall wiped his glasses slowly while continuing to listen. "I didn't expect to feel this tonight," he whispered to himself. The music slowly began to rise again. The quiet section gradually built into something stronger and more exciting. Her hands traveled quickly across the keyboard, moving from one end of the piano to the other with graceful control. Now the audience could truly see the level of skill she possessed. The notes flowed like waves, rising higher and higher. Some people in the audience exchanged surprised looks. They had seen many performances in this hall before, but this one felt different. This was not just music. It felt like a moment of discovery. The quiet worker they had barely noticed before was revealing a talent that few had imagined. As the melody grew more powerful, the energy in the room changed. The audience felt it in the air around them. It was the feeling that comes when people witness something unexpected and beautiful at the same time. One of the organizers leaned closer to the other and whispered quietly, "We should have invited her to perform a long time ago." The other organizer smiled slightly. "I think she never told anyone she could." On the stage, the young woman's hands moved with remarkable speed now. The notes raced across the piano in bright, flowing patterns. Yet every sound remained clear and controlled. She was no longer thinking about whether the audience liked the performance. She was simply playing the music that had lived inside her heart for years. The final section of the piece was approaching. The melody rose into a powerful and emotional climax. Her hands moved confidently through the last challenging passages, her fingers dancing across the keys with energy and grace. The audience watched in complete silence. It felt as though the entire room was holding its breath. Then the music slowed slightly, preparing for the final moment. Her right hand played a beautiful rising line of notes while the left hand supported the harmony below. The sound filled the hall with warmth. And then, after one last graceful movement across the keys, she pressed the final chord. The sound rang out clearly through the room. For a brief moment, the note echoed gently against the walls of the hall. Then the music faded into silence. The young woman slowly lifted her hands from the piano. Her heart was still beating quickly, but a calm feeling spread through her chest. For a second, the entire hall remained completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the quiet moment that sometimes follows something truly special, when people need a second to understand what they have just experienced. And then, suddenly, the silence broke. Applause filled the room. At first it was strong. Then it grew louder. Within seconds, the entire audience was clapping, cheering, and smiling with amazement. The young woman looked out at the crowd, surprised by their reaction. She had only planned to help fill a small gap in the program. But somehow, that simple moment had turned into something unforgettable. And the evening was far from over. For a moment after the final note faded, the hall stayed completely still. The sound of the piano had disappeared, but the feeling of the music remained in the air like a soft echo. The young woman kept her hands resting gently above the keys, almost as if she was still listening to the last note inside her mind. Then suddenly the silence broke. A loud wave of applause rose from the audience. People clapped with excitement and surprise. Some stood up from their chairs, while others smiled widely and looked at the person sitting next to them as if to say, "Did you just hear that?" The applause grew stronger with every second. The young woman slowly turned her head toward the crowd. Her expression showed a mix of surprise and uncertainty. She had expected polite clapping for helping the event continue, but the reaction in front of her felt much bigger than that. Felt genuine. Felt emotional. Many people in the audience were clapping with real admiration. Near the front row, a small child stood up and clapped enthusiastically, looking up at the stage with bright eyes. The child's parents smiled and joined the applause as well. Across the hall, the organizers looked at each other with amazement. One of them laughed quietly while shaking his head. "I can't believe we almost missed this," he said. The other organizer nodded while continuing to clap. "And all we asked her to do was play something simple." On the stage, the young woman slowly lifted her hands from the keys and stood up from the piano bench. For a brief moment she felt unsure of what to do next. She was not used to standing in front of a large group of people while they cheered for her. But the applause did not stop. If anything, it grew louder. A few people even stood up, creating a small wave of standing applause that spread through several rows. The young woman smiled shyly and gave a small nod of appreciation toward the audience. Her cheeks warmed slightly, but her eyes reflected a quiet happiness. For years she had kept her connection to music hidden from the world. And now, suddenly, that hidden part of her life had been seen and appreciated by an entire room of people. One of the organizers quickly walked onto the stage, holding the microphone. He waited for the applause to calm down slightly before speaking. "Well," he said with a warm smile, "I think we can all agree that this was not just a simple performance." The audience laughed softly and continued clapping. The organizer turned toward the young woman. "You helped us tonight when we needed someone to fill a small gap in our program," he said kindly. "But what you gave us was much more than that." The crowd responded with another round of applause. The young woman felt both grateful and slightly overwhelmed by the attention. She lowered her head politely and stepped slightly away from the piano. The organizer then asked gently, "Would you mind telling everyone how long you've been playing the piano?" The question caught her a little off guard. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "I learned when I was younger," she said softly. Her voice was calm but humble. "I practiced for many years back then, but it has been a long time since I played in front of people." Her honest answer made the audience even more impressed. Some people whispered quietly to each other. "It didn't sound like someone who hasn't played in years." Another voice replied, "Talent like that doesn't disappear." The organizer nodded with respect. "Well," he said, "I think everyone here is very glad you decided to play tonight." The audience clapped again. The young woman smiled again and gave another small nod. She felt thankful that the audience had listened so warmly. But the evening was not finished yet. As she stepped away from the piano, the organizer leaned slightly closer and spoke quietly. "Would you be willing to play one more short piece?" She blinked in surprise. "Another one?" He smiled gently. "I think everyone here would love to hear more." The audience, sensing what he had suggested, began clapping again with excitement. Some people even called out encouraging words. "Play another one." "Yes, please." The young woman looked out at the audience again. Their faces were full of genuine curiosity and support. This time, the feeling inside her chest was different from before. The nervousness she had felt earlier was almost gone. Instead, there was a quiet sense of confidence growing inside her. For the first time in many years, she felt truly connected to the piano again. She looked back at the instrument standing patiently beside her. The old piano seemed almost familiar now, like an old friend she had not seen in a long time. She took a slow breath. Then she nodded. The audience responded with immediate excitement. She returned to the piano bench and sat down once more. This time, however, the moment felt different. Before, she had been asked to play something simple just to fill time. Now the audience was truly listening. They were ready, and she was ready too. Her fingers rested gently on the keys again. The hall became quiet once more, but this silence felt warmer and more expectant than before. People leaned forward slightly in their chairs. Children sat still. Even the organizers stepped aside quietly so the stage belonged fully to her again. The young woman closed her eyes for a brief moment. A soft smile appeared on her face. Then her fingers moved. The first notes of the new piece floated into the room, light and graceful. This melody was different from the previous one. It felt brighter, more playful, almost like a conversation between the piano keys. The audience listened carefully, already knowing that something special was happening again. As the music continued, the hall filled once more with beautiful sound. And while the audience enjoyed every moment, something even more important was happening quietly inside the young woman herself. For the first time in many years, she was no longer hiding her music. She was sharing it. And that simple change was beginning to open a new chapter in her life. The second melody moved gently through the hall, light and graceful like a quiet breeze passing through an open window. This time the audience listened with a different feeling. Earlier they had been surprised, unsure of what to expect. Now they were fully ready, almost eager, to hear every note she played. The young woman sat calmly at the piano, her hands moving smoothly across the keys. The nervousness she had felt before had completely disappeared. In its place was something peaceful and confident. She was no longer thinking about the crowd or the stage lights. She was simply enjoying the music. Each note flowed naturally into the next. Sometimes the melody danced playfully across the higher keys, sounding bright and cheerful. Other times it slowed down and became soft and thoughtful. People in the audience could feel those changes clearly. A woman sitting near the front smiled quietly as she listened. The music reminded her of calm mornings and warm memories. A few rows behind her, an older man closed his eyes and leaned back slightly in his chair, letting the sound fill the room around him. Even the children who had been restless earlier now sat quietly, curious and focused. The hall felt warm and peaceful. The young woman's fingers moved quickly during some parts of the piece, creating sparkling runs of notes that moved across the piano like tiny waves. Then suddenly the melody would slow down again, becoming soft and delicate. It felt almost like a conversation. The piano spoke, and the audience listened. From the side of the stage, the organizers watched with quiet smiles. They still seemed amazed by what had happened that evening. One of them whispered, "Who would have thought the person who takes care of this hall would turn out to be the best performer tonight?" The other organizer chuckled softly. Life like surprises. On the stage, the music continued to unfold beautifully. The young woman played with ease, as if the piano had been waiting all these years for her to return. For a moment, she remembered the many evenings long ago when she had practiced music alone. At that time she had dreamed about playing for people and sharing those melodies with the world. But life had changed her path. Responsibilities, difficulties, and quiet years had slowly pushed music into the background. Yet somehow the music had never truly left her. It had simply been waiting for the right moment. And tonight that moment had finally arrived. The melody slowly built toward its ending. Her fingers moved across the keys with gentle confidence, bringing the piece to its final beautiful phrases. The last notes floated softly through the hall. Then the music faded into silence once again. For a brief second, the audience remained still, holding onto the peaceful feeling the melody had created. Then applause filled the room once more. This time the clapping sounded warmer, almost like a celebration. People smiled and looked around at each other with admiration. Several audience members stood up again, creating another wave of standing applause. The young woman stood slowly from the piano bench. Her expression was calm, but her eyes reflected deep emotion. She bowed her head slightly to thank the audience. The applause continued for a long moment before gradually settling down. One of the organizers walked onto the stage again, holding the microphone with a bright smile. "Well," he said, looking out at the crowd, "I think tonight will be remembered for a long time." The audience responded with cheerful agreement. He turned toward the young woman. "You came here today simply to prepare the hall like you always do," he continued kindly. "But tonight you gave us something truly special." More applause followed. The young woman smiled shyly again. She seemed a little overwhelmed by all the attention, but she was also clearly grateful. The organizer spoke again. "I believe many people here would love to hear you perform again in the future." Several audience members nodded and clapped in support. Someone from the back of the hall even called out, "Yes, please come back." The young woman laughed softly at that unexpected shout. For a moment she did not know what to say. She had never planned for something like this. Only a few hours earlier she had simply been arranging chairs and cleaning the stage. Now the entire room was looking at her with admiration. She finally spoke quietly into the microphone the organizer offered. "Thank you," she said gently. "I never expected to play tonight." Her voice was calm but sincere. "I only wanted to help when the program needed someone." The audience listened carefully. She continued, "Music has always been very important to me. Even when I stopped playing for many years, it stayed somewhere in my heart." Her simple words touched many listeners. Sometimes the most honest sentences carried the strongest meaning. The organizer nodded respectfully. "Well," he said, "we are very glad that music found its way back tonight." The audience clapped again. As the event slowly came to an end, people began leaving their seats, but many of them stopped near the stage to thank the young woman personally. Some said they had never expected such a performance. Others told her how much the music had touched them. A small child approached shyly and said, "You play the piano like magic." The young woman laughed softly and thanked the child. The hall slowly became quieter again as people left, but the feeling of the evening remained strong. Later, when most of the audience had gone home, the young woman returned to her usual tasks. She began stacking a few chairs and straightening the rows again, just as she had done many times before. But something felt different now. The organizers walked past her and smiled warmly. "You know," one of them said, "this stage suits you very well." She smiled politely. "Maybe," she replied softly. After finishing the last small task, she walked toward the piano once more. The hall was almost empty now, and the stage lights were dim. She gently placed her hand on the piano lid for a moment. Earlier that evening, the instrument had simply been another object she cleaned during her routine work. Now it felt like an old friend she had finally reunited with. She sat down on the bench for a moment and pressed a single quiet note. The soft sound echoed gently through the empty hall. This time she did not stand up quickly. Instead, she smiled to herself, because she knew something important had changed. Music was no longer just a memory from the past. It had returned to her life again. And sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected moment to remind someone of who they truly are.